Hey everyone, Clio here, and today we're talking about the books that I read in the month of October. Now, the month of October has been treating me well in the sense that I finally got around to finishing my TBR and finishing it in a timely manner. I think I had a full week left of mood reading after I finished my TBR, which is definitely a nice change because in the past few months, or at least for the remainder of the year, I think even, I've kind of more been feeling like I've been struggling to get my entire TBR finished, and so I haven't really felt like I had a lot of time for mood reading, and so I was very happy to be able to do that this month. Now, as always, there will be 3 numbers on the screen. First of all, there will be the amount of physical books that I have read on my TBR. At the beginning of this month, there were 55 books on there. Then I also have my book buying credit system. At the beginning of the month, I don't even remember, but the number will be up there. Then the third number that will be up there is the amount of books that I read throughout the month. As we go further along within this video, this number will be climbing. Now, as always, I already filmed a mid-month check-in, and so I will be going through these books relatively quickly in order to get those numbers up to speed. But if you want any further details about my experience with this book, what I thought about them, what they are about, then do go and check that video out. So first thing that happened in the first half of the month was that I added a book, which is The Cat Who Saved Books by Suzuki Natsukawa. This is a book that I also already read in the first half, so it balances out luckily. Other books that I read in the first half of the month are The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet by David Mitchell, The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and then I also reread The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. But so let's dive into the second half of the month. In the second half of the month, I basically only had one TBR book left, and that was The Republic of Thieves by Scott Lynch. So The Republic of Thieves is the third book in the Gentleman Bastard series. In this one, we are following Locke Lamora, basically. He is our main protagonist, but we definitely follow more than just Locke because he's part of this crew that has these sort of heist missions where they're trying to fool the sort of like nobility of the area that they're living in out of their money. And so in the first one, we start off by having a dual timeline where we get to see Locke and his crew perform a major heist, but also get involved within somebody else's heist. While at the same time, we also have another timeline in which we are basically seeing how this crew was created, how this crew was trained, how they got to be the people that they are in the other timeline. So I very much like this sort of like dual timeline structure, and I kind of missed that one in the second one. But the third one definitely came true on that. I think it is the one that does the dual timeline the best. It consistently has dual timeline throughout the entirety of its stories, and both of these timelines have a beginning, middle, end. Both of these stories have a satisfactory conclusion to them. And so I definitely think that that element to it was very well established, that where with the first 2 books I had kind of structural issues, with this one the structure was very well maintained. But I will definitely say that still the first one is my favorite one. I just feel like the emotional stakes within that one are just so damn high, and that the resolution of that book was just so perfectly done that none of the others so far have been able to top that. And so with this one of these timelines that we're looking at basically has a sort of like play being reenacted, and all the time that we were spending in the theater preparing for the play or, you know, rehearsing the play, I would just zone out of it. I'm pretty sure that it probably had some sort of a meta level in which the content of the play reflected the actual storyline of the players, but I couldn't pay attention to that for some reason, so I wasn't able to catch up on that. But so I will say that I was so looking forward to finding out more about Sabata, to finally have Sabata appear, because she's been this sort of like ghost character in the first 2 books who's often referred to and who's clearly had a big emotional impact on Locke. However, ultimately, I kind of did still feel disappointed in what ended up being the storyline for this third book. And so, yeah, the first one will remain my favorite. And as a result, because of the excitement that I had for the first one and the fact that the consequent books have so far disappointed me, I feel like the series is kind of disappointing me as a result. Like, I would have just loved for The Lives of Locke Lamora to be a standalone at this point in time. So I will definitely still continue with it. I'm now caught up to it, and so when the 4th book comes out, I will be continuing with it. But as I have clearly indicated, so far the series as a whole isn't really working for me. Another fantasy that I read this month is Yume by Sifton, Tracey, Anipare. I'm not entirely sure about how to pronounce that last name. This is a very special one. So this was an R copy that I was granted. So my thanks go out to NetKelly and to the publisher for that. And so I read it a little bit late. It came out around the middle section of this month. I also read it around that time, but sadly I didn't get a review out up until this point. And so in this one, basically we have sort of like dual timelines, and basically I see it compared often to Spirited Away or to Alice in Wonderland. So it's basically the sort of idea of a portal fantasy of somebody from the real world ending up into a sort of like dream world, into a sort of like nonsensical world. And I will say that Alice in Wonderland is a book that I absolutely hate, but that is also because I absolutely dislike the character of Alice. But another thing that doesn't really work that well for me in Alice in Wonderland is the nonsensical stuff. And I will definitely say that in the first half of this book, part of what I struggled with was the dream world. So this book takes place in two different locations. So we have what for a very long time feels like a super normal contemporary setting with a contemporary storyline and no sort of like paranormal or supernatural elements involved, which is the Japanese setting in which we see our protagonist Sibel, who is this black woman who is working in Japan, who is teaching English as a second language there. And then we have the dream world, in which we watch a dream walker, Zaniel, I think his name is, and Zaniel basically has made a deal with one of these spirits, one of these yokai, and the deal is basically that he gets protection in exchange for finding this demon girls that he can then have sex with. And so we have these two different stories that at first don't seem to have much in common with one another. The further you get into the story, the more you're starting to see how these stories could interconnect, and the further along, the more they start to interconnect. And in the sort of like second half of this book, we definitely have a lot of blending of these two worlds and so of these two storylines as well. I mainly enjoyed the contemporary realist section of this book. I thought that was really well done, really fascinating to see how this black woman in Japan was being treated, how she had to deal with all of these microaggressions, and the way that she stayed so calm and collected under these microaggressions, which definitely for the reader at least didn't feel like microaggressions anymore after having them occur time and time and time and time again, and having them be performed by people who interact with her on a daily basis for a few years already at this point in time. So I thought that that was really fascinating. Aside from that, I really liked the sort of like integration of Japanese culture within this book. A lot of the text is actually transcriptions from Japanese, which I'm not entirely sure how well they work for people who have had like zero contact with Japanese. I have watched quite a few sort of like Japanese dramas in my days, and so quite a lot of it did make sense to me, but I'm not sure how that would be for somebody who has like zero understanding of Japanese, who hasn't heard a single Japanese phrase in their life, because there is a whole lot of Japanese in there. But I very much enjoyed that aspect to it. I very much enjoyed the sort of like bilingual nature of this story. Aside from that, there's a whole lot of references to Japanese food that just make you want to eat while you're reading this book, which is always something that I like finding in books. And at the same time, we also have a lot of this sort of like Japanese work ethic that is being discussed throughout this book as well. So I found that section to work really well for me, but the dream world, I guess because it is so nonsensical that I struggled a little bit more with it at the beginning. When we got towards the sort of section where I was starting to catch up to how these worlds were connected and where I was just kind of trying to figure out whether I was right about that, I did definitely feel those passages were speeding up. But ultimately, what kind of led to this being not fully satisfactory read for me is the fact that towards the ending, I was kind of growing tired of it. I think that it could have benefited from a little bit more of a harsher edit. I feel like it was a little bit drawn out and they should have like edited it down a little bit. Towards the ending, there's a little bit too much memory loss going on, which then slows down the pacing of the read again, because, you know, you cannot progress into the story if one of your characters doesn't remember what is actually going on, for example. So I feel like that could have been edited down a little bit and that the book would have really benefited from that. But aside from that, I really thought it was a good read, and I would definitely want to look out for more of her works, because I definitely thought that especially the contemporary parts of this story were super well done, and that I was really engrossed in that. And that even though basically that is just a story about a black woman living in Japan, teaching kids and dealing with her sort of like racist colleagues, that really worked very well. There's not a whole lot that plot-wise is happening in that part of the book, but it worked super well. I was super intrigued and engrossed in that section of the book. Another book that I also finished in the second half of the month is Desperate Measures by Katee Roberts. This is basically an erotic retelling of Aladdin, in which Jasmine doesn't end up with Aladdin, but she ends up with Jafar. And Aladdin is actually the bad guy within this story. In principle, this one started out working just fine for me. I really enjoyed the sort of like smut in the beginning. I enjoyed the sort of like consensual, non-consensual sex. So basically it's sort of like role-playing non-consensual sex. That worked for me, but like after the first sex scene or something like that, we introduce a daddy kink into it, and so the characters refer to one another in sexual setting at least as daddy and baby girl, and that just didn't work for me at all. Like, aside from it being cringeworthy for me, I also just found it to be ridiculous from time to time. I could not take that seriously, and so as a result, the smut also really suffered for me in those sections. And when it came to the sort of like thought pattern of our characters and the plot line, it felt very typical for me, and I didn't feel like there was a whole lot exciting stuff going on, except for towards the ending. I feel like the ending definitely subverted my idea of where the story was going to go, and I do definitely appreciate the way that this story was rounded off. But ultimately, why do we read a story like that? We read it for the smut, and the smut really wasn't working for me. So yeah, I'm not going to be continuing on with the series. I know that the other books within this series, for example, have different types of smut, but ultimately I just didn't get enough out of this one. And, you know, I only very rarely pick up a romance. So if this first one already didn't really do it for me, then probably I won't resort to any other of the books within this series. A massive page count for the second half of the month was State of Fear by Michael Crichton. So Michael Crichton is the author of Jurassic Park. It is one of my favorite books of all time. But with Michael Crichton, I've definitely had a mixed experience. Some of his books I really enjoy. I really enjoy a lot of his action thrillers, but some others really don't work all that well for me. And this is sadly one of those that doesn't work for me and that I would definitely not recommend, because, which wasn't clear at the beginning or from the synopsis, because the synopsis is very vague, this is actually a book that deals with eco-terrorists, basically people who want to make sure that climate change is taken seriously. So they want to kind of make these massive climate disasters happen in order for people to take climate change more seriously and to really invest big money into getting a change done. And so obviously I don't condone that, but the whole message of this book isn't just that you shouldn't take things to those extremes. The whole message of this book is that climate change isn't real, or that climate change is basically sort of like hoax that people have put in place in order to control the public, in order to spread fear among the public, which makes your public more tractable, or that makes your public more controllable. And so while Michael Crichton doesn't deny the fact that the natural world is in crisis and that we need to take action in order to help the natural world, what he does deny is the conclusions of climate change, of the idea that greenhouse gas emissions are responsible for global warming. That is basically what he's trying to deny within this book. And a lot of the time in this book is spent on giving counter research, showing research results that are counter arguments to the idea that sea levels are rising, to the idea that temperature is rising, for example. I can link an article down below that also then counteracts his arguments. And I do know that on a whole, most of Michael Crichton's books are criticized for not having great research or having real scientific gaps in the theories that he's exploring. But aside from all of that, I just think there's so much time spent theorizing in this one that the action really suffers. And aside from that, I also feel like the action is basically just put in there to give you somewhat of a thrilling story, but that basically what he really wanted to do was get that research out there, because a lot of the action sequence feel kind of willy-nilly. It feels like there's no real thought going into why action A leads to action B leads to action C. a lot of the time I was just kind of like, wait, why are we going to this place or that? It's basically just more or less them finding out like, oh, this is what they're trying to do over there. Let's go over there and try to stop them. And then, oh, but over there they're doing that. Let's go over there and do that. But as a result, it didn't really feel like a cohesive whole the way that Jurassic Park, for example, felt. And it felt more like we were just going on these different sort of like side plots that together form somewhat of a whole, but not really. And so a lot of the times I would just feel like, how did we end up in these situations again? But a massive problem is definitely the way that I feel like so much effort is put into the climate change denial and into explaining why climate change isn't real. And the tone that is taken up with that from time to time feels very denigrating. And so as a result, it's also not really effective in what it's trying to say neither, I feel, because either you're bored by what he's trying to say, or you take offense at the fact that he's treating you like a small child. So I feel like this was a waste of my time. And for a very long time I was hoping that he would turn things around and end up, you know, saying like, hey guys, all of those climate change deniers are total fakes, and actually climate change is definitely real and we should be taking it seriously. We just shouldn't be going to those extremes. But that's not where this book ended up going. In the author's note, he says that like everybody has an agenda except for him. Everybody's biased except for him. But this book definitely feels very biased, definitely feels like it has an agenda, and it's very heavily pushing that agenda down its reader's throat, which, regardless of the message, I already wouldn't like, and especially because of the message, I despise. Final book that I then finished in the month of October is another reread, and that is a reread of Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. This was not planned, this is very much a mood read, a mood read decision, because in November, at the end of November, the third book in the series is coming out, and I originally hadn't really planned on rereading the series, but in the end I decided to do it, so I reread Skyward this month. Skyward is a YA sci-fi. It definitely feels like it's written a little bit differently than most of Brandon Sanderson's adult work. However, if you are a fan of his adult work, I do think that you would most likely enjoy his YA sci-fi, because there are still very much a lot of elements that are reminiscent of his adult work. Within that, a lot of his plotting, for example, his character work is very reminiscent of that. His humor is definitely also the humor that he puts into his adult writing as well. Now, in this one we are following Spencer. Now, the world in which Spencer lives in is a world that takes bravery as its sort of like top value. Bravery is celebrated, cowardice is frowned upon, cowardice is sort of like the worst thing. The worst thing to be is a coward, basically. The worst insult that somebody can give you is to say that you are a coward. Now, Spencer's father is basically a fighter pilot, and he is sort of like the person she looks up to in life the most. However, when she's still very young, her father is shot down in a battle because he tried to flee the battle. Or at least that's the official line. Spencer does not believe this is true. However, her family does have to deal with the stain of his reputation from that moment onwards. As a result, she has developed this sort of like very brash personality where she makes these sort of like super over dramatic statements about devouring the intestines of her enemies and stuff like that. But she very much is on the path for redemption. She wants to prove that she belongs up there like her father, that she, like her father, is brave to the end. And so she wants to become a fighter pilot just like him. However, the system is very much against her and will work against her every step of the way. I very much love this one, love the way it's plotted, love the character work, love the way that her character develops with the background of the values of this entire culture, the values in which she has been brought up her entire life, and kind of seeing how she's growing up by starting to question those values, starting to question whether cowardice really is the worst thing in the world, for example. So really enjoyed this reread, really loved rediscovering Mbot. I've really forgotten a lot about his sense of humor and how his sense of humor really works, and so I absolutely loved rediscovering that. It's just such a great character, and now I'm really looking forward to diving into Starsight. I didn't enjoy Starsight as much as I loved Skyward, but I'll be very interested to see how I feel about it upon reread now, and then I'll be able to dive into the new novellas and into Cytonic at the end of the month. But so that's my reading for the month of October. I kind of feel like it was somewhat of a disappointing reading month, though I definitely didn't have that feeling throughout the month. And I think a big part of that is just the fact that I was getting so much of my reading done and that I was just able to get my TBR done so quickly and then just add on some stuff that I hadn't really set out to read at the beginning of the month, for example. I am also 70% into an arc at this point in time, but my thoughts on that will be in my November mid-month check-in because I'll only talk to you guys about it when I finish it. So that is it for this video. Let me know if you read any of these books and what your thoughts were on it. If you heard me talk about one of these books and you're interested in it, definitely also let me know. I'm always eager to find out what books people are excited about based on my recommendations. And then, yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video and see you guys for a future one. Bye!